Okay, we're going to move to our next speaker, Tom Battalise, speaking on moving beyond least cost diet formulation to enable a sustainable animal protein value chain. Tom is currently Senior Manager Global Sustainability Metrics for BASF's Nutrition and Health business and has more than 25 years of experience leading organizations across sectors to successfully identify, measure, and develop solutions and strategies for continuous improvement to sustainability opportunities. Since 2012, Tom has been helping to create more sustainable feed and animal protein value chains with an emphasis on life cycle business opportunities. Tom is actively engaged across feed and protein industry activities, including as Vice President of the Board for the Global Feed LCA Institute, member of the iFeeder Sustainability Advisory Board, and member of the Iowa State University National Pork Board Sustainability Advisory Board. Tom holds a master's in energy and environmental policy with a concentration in sustainable development from the University of Delaware, an MBA from Widener University, and a bachelor's in environmental chemistry from Rutgers University.
Okay. Everybody hear me okay? Okay. So I'm going to maybe take a little bit of a different spin here, and Shane gave an excellent presentation that started to touch on a couple of these points, but really to look at how we can zero in on what is the biggest opportunity space on sustainability for livestock value chain. And that is the feed, the diet of the animal, the formulation that the animal is consuming. So you've seen some numbers being thrown around, so maybe some of this is starting to sink in if you haven't already had some exposure to some of the impacts from a scientific standpoint and the challenges that we're facing as a global industry. And I just want to emphasize here on these impacts, it's maybe not so much the numbers, but just to show that carbon is still equated by most organizations today with the term sustainability. So if we work towards net zero carbon or low impact or low carbon products, that means we're sustainable, which is not necessarily the case by any means. And you can see some of the impacts here from the livestock value chain globally, and carbon is just one of them. So carbon, land use, water use, eutrophication from excess nitrogen and phosphorus. And of course, depending on where you live in the world, carbon molecules may not matter if you don't have enough fresh water, or if your fresh water is contaminated by excess nutrients, for instance. So a lot of the local impacts take precedent at times over the carbon molecules in the global atmosphere. You've seen some similar numbers here earlier as well, but the short story is that the challenges that we're facing as a global industry are not going to get easier. So we have a population upwards of 10 billion that's projected for 2050, and a near doubling of food, much of that, of course, continuing to come from animal protein. So the challenges on the left-hand side will not get easier as we go forward. And when we look across the landscape of stakeholder pressures, starting with investors, and this is really a serious flag, because I actually did some work before coming to the food sector with the oil and gas sector, previously working for BP for some years. And the discussions that I'm seeing right now on the investor side related to livestock production, unfortunately, are very similar to what has been going on for the past decade or so with oil and gas. And now you see this movement with oil and gas, fossil fuels overall, for divestment in a lot of funds, which have serious implications for how capital flows move going forward for that sector. Just in the last months, I've started to see similar calls for divestment for investment funds from livestock value chains. So this FAIR initiative, for instance, has been producing a report for the last years. They represent trillions of dollars of investors around the world, and they've essentially put animal protein under the lens, not far off from the fossil fuel sector, calling out the climate aspect, the land, the excess nutrients, and so forth. So this obviously is something that we have to see how we can mitigate as much as possible and prevent the direction that we're seeing with the fossil fuel sector. Obviously, it's totally different aspects that we're talking about, food versus fuel. in terms of the carbon emissions and so forth. And so it's really not fair when you think about it to put it in the same lens, but this is the lens that it's looked at from an environmental perspective. I won't go into details in the European Green Deal. You just saw a lot of details on Europe. There's a significant change in policy around the world, even here in the U.S., you could say, from administration to administration. And the European Green Deal is the most impactful legislation that will also affect the U.S. side as well because of import-export markets, of course. And one point I would just like to call out for purposes of what I'm talking about here today is that for 2024, there's supposed to be, as part of the European Green Deal, there's supposed to be a framework introduced that will basically mandate agri-food product environmental footprint labeling. So the carbon footprint, the water footprint, and so forth on package for agri-food products. You heard a little bit this morning about the Science-Based Targets Initiative, and for those of us in the world that are not as affected as the policy side, for instance, us here in the U.S., not as affected as what's happening in Europe, the market demands are really the pressures that we're beginning to face here. So you see, and I had the same experience about a year or two ago. This number was less than 1,000 organizations. So this is going exponential, and many global organizations signing on to the Science-Based Targets Initiative that basically allows an organization to stay within the 1.5 degree maximum warming agreement that was put forth by the Paris Climate Accord. That may seem distant, but this has implications from farm to fork for the reason that you see there that nearly 200 retailers have signed on, also restaurants, major brands. And when they're signing on not just for their own emissions, but what is called Scope 3 emissions or the supply chain emissions. So this means that all of the products that they're selling ultimately will need to have carbon neutral raw materials and inputs coming into those final production systems. On the consumer side, we're seeing more and more of a shift. The consumer is willing to pay a premium for more sustainable products, particularly the younger generations. In the past couple of years, there's been a movement beyond just saying that they're willing to spend money, but then when it comes to opening the wallet, in past years, the surveys were showing it didn't match, and now that's shifting. You already saw some better details on the Netherlands policies there. Belgium has very similar policies going into effect related to the nitrogen topic as well. And on the right-hand side is maybe one we haven't heard today so far. New Zealand is looking to be the first spot where we may have an official carbon tax coming out of the country for livestock production, which is targeted to go into effect in 2025 for livestock production because of the carbon emissions associated. There's another country here in the U.S. called California that, a few years back, maybe you're aware, but a few years back they've already instituted this target of 40% emissions reductions from overall livestock, so cattle and pork. Maybe California is not a large pork producer, but of course it has implications because typically what starts in California begins to spill over into other states over the coming years. And so just to go back to what we're facing here in the U.S., more so than the policy at this moment, which is the market pressure. So you have on the right-hand side the food brands, the retailers, the consumers that are all putting pressure, saying we want more sustainable food. We're setting science-based targets to implement net zero carbon goals and the like. And essentially that means that they're putting pressure back on the supply chain, all the way back, for example, to the animal feed that is coming into the production system. Some examples of goals that have already been set, so from the Cargill to JBS to Tyson, Hormel is establishing science-based targets this year as well. And you can see very aggressive goals. For instance, JBS, largest meat producer in the world, has a 2040 goal. not just for its own operations, but again, for the entire supply chain. So 2040 seems like a long way off, but less than 20 years to make that entire production system net zero carbon means there's a lot of work ahead for our value chain. So there was a touch this morning in one of the plenary sessions on that mentioned life cycle assessment, and what I'm going to steer towards here in terms of what we can look at for everyday feed formulation practices actually goes and there's a basis around life cycle assessment. So on the left-hand side is basically the basics of what life cycle assessment is all about. Essentially, it's input-output modeling. So all of the inputs coming into a given value chain, so in our case with pork, everything from the feed to the energy to the transportation, packaging, and so forth has an impact. That goes through various environmental data modeling and algorithms in order to come up with the environmental footprint. And the environmental footprint that we're talking about here is, again, not just carbon footprint, but also water, land use, and so forth. The beauty of life cycle assessment is that it allows you to understand the trade-offs in decision making. So what we don't want to do as an industry is strive towards, for example, net zero carbon, and at the end of the day, we end up increasing our land use by 5 times or our water use by 5 times or whatever it might be. On the right-hand side is an example of that. So this is some work that BASF did in Europe, actually, on German pork production with the Bavarian Agricultural Agency. And when we normalized and aggregated the environmental impact of the German pork production, you can see that carbon footprint was about 10% of the 100% of environmental impact, while the other impact areas, land use, water use, eutrophication, were all significantly higher. This doesn't mean that we, stop working on carbon, but it does mean that as we're looking at German pork production in this case, we need to consider that as we steer towards reducing carbon, that we're not subsequently increasing the impacts in the other impact fields. And the big opportunity, as I mentioned at the beginning, is feed. So feed is 50 to 80% of the environmental impact of pork and of meat, milk, and eggs in general. On the left-hand side is the same German pork production study where you see this is total aggregated environmental impact going across 10 different environmental impact categories. You see about half is directly from the feed, from the diet of the animal. Another third is coming from the manure and excretion of the animal, which obviously has direct or indirect links with the diet of the animal as well. On the right-hand side is the U.S. life cycle output that was funded through the National Pork Board as well. And you see here on carbon footprint specifically about 60%. So this is carbon over time. And you see about 60% on average of the carbon footprint coming from the feed, from the diet of the animal itself. When we look from ingredient to ingredient, there's a natural variation in environmental impact, because obviously where you're growing requires different fertilization application. What you're growing has different yields or different fertilizers, different irrigation, and so forth. So you see this variation, and this is carbon footprint. This is actually some data from what's known as the GFLI database, the Global Feed Life Cycle Assessment Institute database, which basically was started by all of the major feed associations, so AFIA, FAFAC, IFIF, and so forth around the world, to put together one source of truth, if you will, for environmental life cycle data at a regional, at a state level. And so this is carbon footprint. You can see variation not only from ingredient to ingredient, but also from region to region. So if you look at the soybean, I was looking for the laser. Maybe it doesn't have one. If you look at the soybean production there, and you see the vertical line going from less than 1 kilo of carbon to more than 6 kilos of carbon per kilo of soybean produced. This is representative of 12 different countries that have data in the GFLI database, and The less than 1 kilo of carbon is U.S. and some of the Western European production areas for soy, and the more than 6 is, for example, Brazilian soy, some of the Asian production systems and so forth, where there's heavy deforestation that therefore results in significantly increased carbon footprints. So not only are there differences in what we source, what ingredients we source, and what we feed the animals, but where those ingredients are sourced from can cause a significant difference in the environmental impact. And so how do we start to begin to move towards a more sustainable feed approach with pork production? This is a basic journey that is required in order to start to use the life cycle data. So first we need a methodology that puts together harmonized guidelines, a harmonized approach on how to actually shape a study for these different footprints, because there can be a wide variation if there's not a single methodology that is followed. And so the UN Food and Agriculture Organization, FAO, has put together over the past years standard approaches for life cycle assessment for all of the primary species with animal protein production as well as feed production. So we have a methodology, we have a harmonized approach that we can use from a global perspective to start to do these studies. We have the data that has begun to come together through the GFLI database primarily that puts together harmonized data for a regional approach. And then once you have the methods, once you have the data, we begin to think, how can we begin to use electronic tools, digital approaches in order to assess the overall life cycle assessment of our production systems. And ultimately, there's lots of data flowing out there, so not just environmental data, but data that becomes inputs for environmental data from farm to fork, whether that's irrigation sensors on the field, connected to the John Deere tractor and so forth. There's more and more interconnectivity that is allowing more and more automation, as you'll see in bringing this life cycle data together. And ultimately, the future is one where there's will be a digitally integrated value chain for the entire, in this case, pork production system, where we see primary data flow farm to fork. And where we are today is really in this space in the middle with tools and interconnectivity. And I'd like to talk a little bit more about that to show how that relates to formulation. So I mentioned already that 50 to 80% of everyday, the everyday impact of pork production is coming from the feed itself. But less than 5% of nutritionists, when we look around the world and here in the US, less than 5% of nutritionists or formulators are including sustainability aspects in everyday formulation. So decisions are being made that ultimately affect and result in this 50 to 80% from the diet of the animal, yet there's a disconnect in the information flow with the nutritionists and formulators that are making those decisions. And so from our work at BASF, we brought together basically a first-to-market approach linking everyday feed formulation practices that today is done on a least cost basis, looking for that least cost diet and bringing in the environmental sustainability aspects from a life cycle perspective. So, and this is not just on a formulation on its own, but also on the overall final performance of the animal, the final farm, and down to the cold carcass weight, essentially, and the environmental impact associated with final production. And it's important that we think, when we think about formulation, while the big impact is on formulation, we need to think also from a holistic approach how that formulation ultimately is affecting the on-farm performance and the manure management and different aspects on farm. So we have the opportunity to essentially look in a digital way at the footprint on the feed itself, on a per ton of feed basis, on a live weight basis, or on a cold carcass weight basis on the final slaughter house. This is an example of some work that we've done here with a customer here in the U.S. where we were looking at different feed formulations in the same price point and looking for variations in ingredients that could provide an opportunity for, in this case, carbon footprint reduction. So we saw the opportunity for about a 14% reduction when we looked across these different formulations, different ingredients, a 14% reduction in carbon footprint by modifying the formulation itself. When we modeled that out over the life of the pig, it basically resulted in about an 8% reduction in environmental or in carbon footprint. So going from a 14 to an 8%, in the end, the most important number is the pork itself. That's where the pressure is on. That's what consumers are seeing in the supermarket. If we go to the supermarket and are picking out a pork chop, we're not thinking about the feed coming into that. At least most consumers aren't. They're thinking about the pork itself. So as an industry, as we formulate, we need to think holistically in terms of how the formulation decisions are ultimately affecting the final impact of the pork itself straight through to the consumer product. Because if we have this case where we have targets on the final pork product and we're stopping at this 14% thinking we're achieving our goal, we may or may not be in the end, and we need to take it through the full value chain. So this is where we are today on formulation approach. You're looking at the various ingredients, the various formulation options and the associated costs, and pinpointing that least cost, and essentially how we can look at this going forward tomorrow in order to assess our environmental footprint as we formulate, is to look at what are the different options within a given price point, potentially with some tolerance on the cost in order to allow also the evolution of some premium products that result in a significant reduction in environmental footprint overall. So just a quick case study. This is a scenario that was put together by my colleague. Maybe a couple of you know her, Lauren Rosberg, who has done some work in our BASF Animal Nutrition Group, and looking at 3 different diets essentially. There was a baseline standard corn, soy, DDG diet. Then there were 2 reduced corn and soy diets, one with rye and one with bakery waste. These are the diets just quickly. So this is the basically 6-phase system that was evaluated. This is the baseline diet with the corn, soy, and DDGs, along with the different additives, vitamins, premix, and so forth that are on top. And then the same 6-phase system with some reduced corn and soy, but replacement with rye and bakery waste. And the results essentially showed, in terms of total aggregated environmental impact reduction, the bakery byproduct having about a 13% reduction in total environmental impacts, and the rye diet resulting in about a 20% impact reduction. Seeing what Shane just presented, he showed one where they're able to achieve a 30% reduction with some different type of beans that they're using there in their farm system. So there's the opportunity for very significant environmental impact reduction, double-digit impact reduction when we start to play around with different feed formulation scenarios. This is the same case study and what resulted on the carbon footprint side. So you see the rye diet having about an 8% reduction in carbon, and the bakery waste having about a 17% reduction in carbon. So the main differences were the crude protein and phosphorus content, a shift in ingredients, as I showed to you with the diets that were used, that essentially altered the corn and soy concentration. Now, this is something that has to be done on an ongoing basis, because obviously the prices of the commodities, especially lately, have been having wild swings, right? So this is something that, as we formulate on an ongoing basis, there's opportunities that this week may be completely different from next week. So essentially what we're talking about here in terms of opportunity with everyday feed formulation is taking this opportunity on sustainability, this 50 to 80% impact, putting the insights into the hands of the formulators, the nutritionists, those that are making decisions on an everyday basis on that 50 to 80%, and essentially operationalizing the sustainability. So traditionally, sustainability is managed within organizations by people like myself, or if there's a sustainability person or sustainability team, or if for smaller organizations where you don't have that, it could be a strategy person, a marketing person that is trying their best to work on sustainability. Ultimately, where this needs to go is to bring this to an operational level, and on the formulation setup, this is essentially the opportunity to bring that to an operating level and embed the sustainability aspects into everyday activities of formulation decisions. So the benefits of all of this essentially is the opportunity to look for impact reductions that result from formulation on the formulation itself, but also at farm level as to how the formulation decisions affect the on-farm performance of the animals. And this ultimately then leads back to the storytelling that we need to be able to do to respond to all of these stakeholder pressures that we have going on in the marketplace. So using credible science-based approach to come back with numbers that shows the opportunities that we can invest in and the opportunities that result as a result of those investments. There's also the ability, and we're doing this from the BASF side, to have interoperability with everyday feed formulation systems. So feed formulation is supported through linear optimization software, as most of you know better than myself, I'm sure. And essentially we can link these systems in order to have the opportunity for efficient flow of the formulation ingredients, and depending on which system that you're using, animal performance data to also flow into the life cycle assessment software approach. So the future of where we're going, not just as BASF, but really as an industry here and as a value chain, is towards this fully digitally integrated value chain. Farm to fork approach, so you can imagine a future where the ad hoc technologies that we have today, whether that's the irrigation sensors on farm that are sending data to the farm management software and the John Deere tractor, to facial recognition technology that we have today of the animal. And you can imagine a future where we know exactly what each animal has eaten, where those ingredients were sourced from, which farm or which production facility, which region, and exactly what the impact is for each of those ingredients, the irrigation, the fertilizer inputs, and so forth, so that you can essentially arrive at real-time environmental footprinting and know exactly what the footprint of pork chop A versus pork chop B is on the supermarket shelf. We're doing some pilot activities here with different partners, and this is something that will come together as an industry. So it's not going to be just one organization that will make this happen. There's still a lot of work that needs to come together, but this is really the future of where all of this data management approach is headed. And this is just an example of some of the partners that we're working with on the formulation software side, along with, for example, Vonix, Shot Horse Feed Research. These are experts in the nutrition side that can help us enhance the sustainability aspects and what we're doing from the digital sustainability value chain approach. And essentially, they can provide insights into the sustainability from a nutritional perspective. They're using our approach globally with nutrition consultation approaches in the industry globally in order to further improve the sustainability aspects of the overall value chain. So, thanks for the opportunity to talk about how we can move beyond least cost formulation, and I guess we have maybe a couple minutes for questions.
So on these ingredients, you've got to be putting some kind of a carbon value on them, and if Gene's putting nitrogen on his rye and I'm not, that's going to be different. So if you got a carbon value, this is no big deal. But how are you coming up with these carbon values on these count how far they're being transported? Is that taken, what's
Yeah.
it all? How are you coming up with them damn numbers?
Good question. That is the $1 million question, right? No, so I had the one, I can jump back to here. I had the one chart that shows the GFLI database, for instance. So I would say this is the starting point of where much of the industry is today, right? So this data is coming essentially from data that has been provided from the regions around the world, or the states in the case of the US, for average production systems. So this is the average. So if he's using more nitrogen than you, or whatever it might be, whatever variation, that would not be captured if you're in the same region, right? So then you have the opportunity to essentially overwrite, and if you have the primary data, I showed where it's going in the future, and the future will be that everyone will have this type of data flowing at scale, right? That's not where we are today.
And where it's irrigated or not, all those things would come in.
Exactly, yeah.
How far it is being transported, would that come into it?
Yes, so the modeling includes everything in there, the transportation, the utilities, the energy, and so
When
forth.
we got to the end of this, and when it was saying 17 or 12%, or whatever it was saving, then you said something about nitrogen and phosphorus. And so then that was another negative, that you were having to get rid of the excess nitrogen that through the pig. That was the other part.
Yes,
It's the manure application.
exactly, yeah.
So if we're going to be sustainable, we have to be profitable, otherwise we won't be here next year.
Sure.
So where does that factor come in?
Yeah, so I didn't have the latest numbers on here, but my colleague that did the work on the example I showed did look at cost. At the time that it was done a few months back, the scenarios were within a pretty low cost tolerance, additional cost. Understanding, to your point, that every penny counts in the end. But we have found through many scenarios with customers that you're able to, when you start to look outside of, for example, just corn and soy, and start to look at some alternative ingredients and byproducts and so forth, there's opportunities to achieve noticeable environmental impact reduction within the same price point. And if you're willing to accept a 1, 2, 3% cost premium, then that opportunity for impact reduction just goes up significantly.
So is rye even realistic? I mean, when do you harvest a winter rye as grain? Help me understand that.
That's a question beyond me, I have to admit.
I mean, I got $20,000.
I'm not a nutritionist, so.
But my point is, we have $20,000 an acre ground that can raise 30 bushels of rye.
Mhm.
And I can't plant much of a crop after that. I mean, if I can double crop it and still get 250 bushels of corn, but what if I can only get 180 bushels of corn because I had a rye crop that produced 30 bushels of rye? I mean, that's not sustainable.
No. Yeah,
So
I mean,
I'm just talking about what are some realistic alternatives, beyond, like rye's not even on the radar for grain in the northern climates.
yeah,
So, I mean, these are great questions, but we got to find out what's.
agree. And I wish I had a colleague here and that could, talk to that a little bit more coherently. Sorry. Yes.
We talked a lot about the ingredients, but in your models, does that include pelleting, mash, the feed mill, the energy that it would take? It takes more energy to grind like a harder grain, like
Yeah.
sorghum versus corn. Is all of that in those
Yes.
ingredients as well?
Yeah, so you would include all the energy, the transportation, everything that is used to produce the end product. If you're looking at per ton of feed, then it's through the feed mill gate. If you're looking at the per ton of pork produced, then it's everything straight through the slaughterhouse for all of the inputs. And that would be, based on the user data essentially. So, yes, in the back.
So if you're Mandy, this is very important, right, because she's selling to Walmart. But for the independent producers out there, like in Europe, are the independent producers, are they thinking about this yet, the smaller farmers?
Yeah. So Europe is a whole nother story, and I was at a conference by the Format Solutions, Brill software people basically, and one of the managing directors was talking about carbon footprinting, including in similar concept basically of what I'm talking about here. And he's based out of London. Most of his work is within Europe, and he said, if I look back 2-3 years, and I would say the conversation that we're just starting here in the U.S. on this topic was where Europe was 2 or 3 years ago. Now, he said 75% of the people that he's talking to, from small to large multinational organizations, are either doing something already, particularly on the carbon topic and formulating practices, or they're actively looking for an approach to do that because of all of the legislation, as Shane was talking about, and because of the market pressures. So Europe is significantly ahead in this space.
We have time for one more question.
So what are some of the changes that you're seeing in Europe related to these type of measurements and calculations?
So I think with where Europe is at this time, I mean, we see examples where they're actively reformulating, but the majority are basically getting their baseline together in order to start to understand where the hotspot opportunities are, because a lot of this is still, I would say, in the R&D or innovation understanding mode. And then over the next couple of years, there'll be much more activity that results in actual changes, similar to what Shane was presenting. All right, thank you.
Let's thank Tom one more time.